Hello and welcome to Das German Kritic, weil hey, außer mir macht's ja keiner. And to be frank, reviewing this part is gonna be a bit difficult because not a lot of stuff actually happens plot-wise in this part. Hagen dumps the Nibelungen treasure in the Rhine River, Kriemhild marries Attila the Hun, in the Nibelungen saga referred to as Ezel, to use them in a revenge on Hagen, followed by a large climax, and the rest I won't spoil for you. But, as I said, I do want to talk a little bit about the historical and literary history of both the text and the movie, so I think we do have enough material here for a decent review. With that said, let's dive into Part 2 of Fritz Lang's Nibelungen, Kriemhild's Revenge. So, as said, the film begins with Hagen dumping the Nibelungen treasure into the Rhine so that Kriemhild can smelt it and make weapons out of it. And I'm confused already, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. As I've said in part 1, there are numerous different interpretations of the same story. In one interpretation, when Siegfried finds the Nibelungen treasure, he's met by the treasure's guardians, which are essentially a couple of ghosts who tell him that the treasure is cursed and that anyone who takes the treasure is cursed as well. Thus, in this interpretation, Hagen dumps the treasure in order to stave off any evil that might still come from the cursed treasure, although by this point it's obviously too late. Which reminds me, I was going to talk about the historical and literary history of this film, wasn't I? When talking about the literary history of the Nibelungen saga, the majority of the sources come from the Edda, a collection of Norse stories, most of them involving the Norse gods. In this respect, the Nibelungen actually has a lot in common with the Bible, specifically the book of Genesis, which is also compiled of several different legends. The story of Adam and Eve and the tree and the snake, for example, is taken from a story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in which the god Enki trespasses on the sacred garden of the goddess Inanna and eats from the fruit of the forbidden tree therein. Unfortunately for him, he gets discovered by the goddess Ninhursag, who then causes him to fall. But then later she decides to forgive Enki for his transgressions and creates 7 daughters to help him. One of them was Ninti, the goddess of health and healing, for she was created to close the rib to his side. The same can be found in the Edda with regards to the Nibelungen. For example, the Edda expands a little on Siegfried's youth in Xanten. No version of the Nibelungen saga ever talks about this. When Siegfried, in the Edda referred to as Sigurd, kills Fafnir the dragon, not only is he not alone, but before Fafnir dies, he actually says a few words to Siegfried. In another tale of the Edda, Siegfried and Brunhild are together. Also, Brunhild is part of the Valkyries, not just the Queen of Iceland. So after this, Kriemhild hears of the Huns from their emissary, Rutger von Becklon, played by Rudolf Rittner. He tells her that Ezel, the king of the Huns, played by Rudolf Klein-rogge, intends to marry her, and Kriemhild decides to heed his call, with the intent to use the Huns' destructive power in a revenge against Hagen and her brother. And Kriemhild isn't at all secret about that either. After the two meet and finally marry, Kriemhild asks him outright if he will side with her in Kriemhild's intended destruction of Hagen and her brother. He agrees. Well, at least it worked better than for Lord Friendzone when he told Daenerys that he was spying on her the entire time. In fact, the similarities between Daenerys and Kriemhild and the Dothraki and the Huns are indeed very similar. Very much like Kriemhild, Daenerys also marries Khal Drogo with the purpose to use the Dothraki to claim the throne for her own. In fact, the similarities are so similar, I'm not quite convinced that J.R.R. Martin didn't use Kriemhild as basis for the Daenerys character, although obviously there are some differences between the two. Since being married has turned the proud Hunnic king into a couch potato as they besiege Rome, his men naturally make fun of him. Ezel decides to kill one of them, but luckily for the poor guy, a messenger arrives telling Ezel that Kriemhild has borne him a son. Naturally, even a violent rider barbarian is overjoyed about this and hastily rushes to his court. Filled with happiness, Ezel agrees to Kriemhild's plan to invite her family and Hagen over to celebrate.
We have enemy ships in Sector 47! It's a trap!
So Hagen, Gunther, as well as Giselher, Kriemhild's other brother, who is married to Rutger's sister now, stay at Etzel's court. Of course, this entire venture isn't intended to be a happy gathering, and thus, Kriemhild asks her husband to use this opportunity to rid themselves of Hagen and her brother. Okay, wait. You've been with the Huns for 2 to 3 years now, judging by the age of your child, and it's only now that you realize the Huns don't take kindly to the whole killing guests idea? Since Ezel proves to be rather uncooperative in this matter, Kriemhild persuades some of the Huns to go out and kill Hagen. Yet, Hagen manages to escape, now knowing that all of this was just a cynical trap. And the end of this is literally just one huge climax in which the Huns and Gunther's men fight to the death. This incidentally involves Kriemhild torching the royal palace with Hagen and Gunther's men inside when things don't go according to her plan. By the way, what you're seeing there isn't a special effect, in the sense that they didn't just build a small-scale model and then superimpose the flames over it. No. Lange actually built the entire thing to scale and then actually had it burned to the ground. The event was, of course, a mass spectacle with numerous onlookers, members of the press, and dozens of fire trucks ready to extinguish the flames once the scenes were completed to Lange's satisfaction. The entire scene speaks to the genius or insanity of Fritz Lang, and what a passionate director he really was, demanding almost inhuman expectations of both cast and crew. To quote Schletto, "Getting up at 5 in the morning and back home at 10 in the evening. Always insanity to the boiling point. It is almost enthralling to see how Lang works. Such a quick pace and wonderful images. He's also a pure genius, which makes you forgive a lot of things." So Lang and I got into a humongous fight. Lang accused me of joking around. I was supposed to carry lows with his 155 pounds through the sea of flames on my outstretched arms down a spindly ladder. Using all the strength I had left, I simply couldn't carry Lois, and Lung believed I didn't want to. Finally, Lung's arguments turned into an angry tirade, and in the end, I caught a major fit. Would have been better to smack Lung across the face, but then everything would have been over. And just as in Nosferatu, in a world so saturated with CGI and digital effects, watching something like this nowadays is a truly great experience. This entire last scene lasts 30 minutes, which reminds you of a certain other director who tends to exaggerate the climax of his movie to an almost ungodly length. But unlike certain lesser forms of art this show doesn't deal with, at least here, you do have to give these last 30 minutes some slack. For one, you can actually tell the two parties apart from one another, and if you don't already know how it ends, you do want to find out. But before I tell you how it ends, I feel that we need to talk about the historical happenings and events that eventually found their way into the Nibelungen saga. Now, if you haven't guessed by now, there are two historical people the Nibelungen saga brings into focus: the Huns and the Burgundians. We're going to take a look at the Huns for a moment. We know that the Huns were a nomadic people who, around 400, ruled from the coast of the Black Sea to the Alps. Then, in 435, Attila finally rises to power and takes the Huns straight to the gates of Rome. But oddly enough, doesn't actually go through with sacking it. In 453, Attila married a Burgundian girl named Ildigo and then died in his wedding night. Here we see the first influence of history on the Nibelungen saga, as Ildigo means Hildchen, which is a suffix designed to minimize female names. Names such as Kriemhild. The Burgundians, on the other hand, first come into the focus of world history around 400 when the Burgundy king Gundahar establishes a small kingdom. Yet, 36 years later, the Burgundians were attacked by a Roman general known as Flavius Aetius. Interestingly enough, the same person who would go up against the Huns roughly 10 years later. Displaced, the Burgundians finally settle in a region that would later become the Kingdom of Burgundy, and today is comprised of 3 French départements. Also, in the Burgundy culture, it was custom that several brothers not only ruled alongside each other, but also had very similar names. Very much what we see with Gunther, Giselher, etc., or with Siegfried and his father Siegmund. Now, with that out of the way, I'm pretty sure you all want to know how this entire thing wraps up. Well, after everyone except Hagen, Gunther, and Hildebrand, another one of Gunther's vassals, managed to escape the burning inferno, Kriemhild demands of Hagen that he tell her where he hid the Nibelungen treasure. But because of the whole Nibelungentreue and all that, Hagen won't tell her. This leads to Kriemhild going completely bonkers and having her own brother beheaded by Ezel to further pressure Hagen into telling her where the treasure is. Yet, Hagen still remains silent, and being so enraged by this, Kriemhild takes up a sword and eventually kills Hagen. Whew, finally, it's about time this all thing came to an end. I'm sure now everyone gets there happily.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
So, we're not only at the end of the review to Kriemhild's Revenge, but also at the end of the review of the entire Nibelungen saga. And I do kind of feel obligated to non-German viewers to explain why I still do like this story very much, despite its little flaws here and there. For one thing, the Nibelungenlied is one of the best examples of how history and literature can shape the final product of a legend or myth. It's really interesting to look at the historical happenings of the migration period or read the tales of the Edda and then stand back and observe what future generations made of that. Another reason why I like this tale so much is because, unlike the Edda, for example, the Nibelungen saga actually does talk about the whole aspect of the human condition and human relationships and explores these facets quite well, actually. Yes, Siegfried is a dick. Yes, Siegfried is a deplorable cunt weasel that deserves to fall in a hole. But that's sort of the point of the entire story, isn't it? If Siegfried hadn't assaulted the hobos, then Mime wouldn't have led him to the dragon. If Siegfried hadn't been an accomplice in raping Brunhild, no one would have ever talked of revenge. The character of Kriemhild is also a very interesting subject to explore. And just as with Siegfried, her entire character in the first part is the sole reason for a descent into madness in part 2. Being frustratingly naive in the first part, this naivete then transforms into single-mindedness driven by hate, wrath, and anger. Because of her naive devotion to Siegfried, she can't even conceive of the possibility of leaving everything in Worms behind and starting a new life with Ezel and the Huns, and instead uses them in her scheme against Hagen and her brother. So that's basically all I have to say about this movie specifically. Join me in the epilogue, where I'll be discussing the actual text of the Nibelungen saga a little bit more, as well as go into a little bit more detailed analysis of the movie as a product in terms of history, influence past and present, talk a little bit about the cast, and so on. This was Das German Kritic, but hey, außer mir macht's ja keiner.